Hello and welcome to the Iowa League of Cities presentation of the 2023 New Laws of Interest. My name is Daniel Stalder. I work here with the League of Cities in the Government Affairs Department, and we are pleased to be able to tell you that New Laws of Interest, the publication, will be published in the July Cityscape magazine. Additionally, we'll be sending this document out in Legislative Link, our legislative newsletter, as well as League Weekly. So please get signed up for those presentations if you have not. A lot of hard work did go into and consideration goes into these documents after session adjourns, not to mention the countless of hours that we spend during session in the Capitol honing, working on, and combating occasionally pieces of legislation. So we hope you will take the time to familiarize yourself with this document because of how important this content is to cities holistically. And finally, before I get started, as always, I want to make sure that nothing here is confused with legal advice. Always consult your city attorney as how a specific law affects your city ordinances, as every city ordinance is unique. Every city has unique circumstances that need to be carefully considered whenever they are interacting with new laws. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. But before, of course, we dive into the meat of our conversation today, I do want to talk just a little bit about the legislative session that wrapped up earlier this year. We are currently in the middle of the 90th General Assembly. For those of you who remember back to your Civics 101, Iowa legislative timetable is actually split into general assemblies, which consist of two legislative sessions. 2023 wrapped up the first of these, and in 2024, there will be the second session of the 90th General Assembly. Now, this is important to note that because of the numeric system that they use to file bills, this system resets for general assemblies, but will continue will reset for general assemblies, but does not for individual legislative sessions. So when 2024 kicks off in the legislative session of 2024, we will not see a new House Study Bill 1, but we'll see a House Study Bill 256 because the last House Study Bill that they introduced was 255. If you look at our new laws document from years prior, which are available on our website, you will see House File 654, but it's critically important that if you're looking at past years of new laws documents, that you pick the correct General Assembly, as this bill number will have different content for each General Assembly. That is, if you get a chance to check out our website, our new laws of interest for the last few years are published right along to 2023. So if there's a bill that you didn't see this year that you may have think passed last year, that's a great place to start. The 2023 legislative session lasted 114 days this year. Per diem, the legislative salary, which oftentimes indicates just how long a session will last, ended on the 100-day mark. And so, of course, those 4 extra days are just a little bit of overtime to iron out some of the more complex legislative projects that they worked on. And then in odd years, such as 2023 is, sessions per diems last 110 days. And in even years, or election years, as some people call them, per diem runs for 100 days, which allows for additional time for legislators to prepare for the election that fall. So we just ended the longer of the 2 legislative sessions. And of course, we look forward to that sine die date, which this year, of course, ended on May 4th. Now, after legislative session, there is a governor's veto period. This year, that concluded on June 2nd, and that starts once the once the legislative session adjourns sine die. Now, the governor did utilize her veto authority this year on 2 different occasions. One was an outright veto, another was a line item veto, but neither of these issues cared deeply about cities. I just want to make sure it's important to know that because the legislature approves a bill, this doesn't guarantee it turns into law. The House and the Senate can pass a bill unanimously, but of course the governor gets a veto or a signature on everything as well. And so that's an important date to keep in mind. But as I mentioned, now the session is over. There is still an immense amount of work to be done, both by the legislature and, of course, by the League's government affairs team, who monitors the legislature very closely. For instance, I would just give you as an example, the Administrative Rules and Review Committee is a bipartisan group of legislators who, following the outline of code described in Chapter 17A, essentially provide the color, the details, the nuance, to an otherwise black and white legislation and fill in the gaps on a lot of things that are necessary to implement a law in the real world. A lot of important caveats and nuances are decided at this process, And so it ends up being a little bit cumbersome. And this process is trusted to a fairly small group. I believe it's only 8 or even 10 legislators that convene during the interim as well as during session to make sure that the administrative rules are sort of adopted and honed throughout the year. In addition to the Administrative Rules and Review Committee, there are ad hoc committees created by the legislature, which convene during the interim, as well as there are permanent statutory committees, such as the Pension Review or the Tax Credit Review Committees. All of this is mostly routine and done with little media attention and little fanfare, but obviously with very important details coming up, it is oftentimes something that we can miss us through the process. So if you are interested in this, of course, follow our work on Legislative Link. That is where we summarize the vast majority of the content that is being displayed throughout the year. Now, before we talk too much about the individual sessions, I want to talk a little bit about the themes that overtook the session entirely. And I want to do this because I think it's very important to know that there are more than 200 bills signed into law. There were hundreds more considered, and the vast amount of content working its way through the legislature means that your specific House member or your specific senator may not be able to recall every bill that you care about or are able to recite. Each individual legislator likely has a core group of bills that they work on that they would know inside and out the way that we understand city policy. But if you rattle off some random bill number, say House File 17, or even a specific topic that was addressed through legislation, say self-supported municipal improvement districts, unless that legislator you're talking to served on the subcommittee, had an important role throughout the committee process, or maybe even if there was an extensive debate on the bill, it's not likely that they're going to know exactly what that bill is about. And that's just a fact of the matter of how many pieces of legislation go through a very finite amount of time and how the legislature is organized. Now, of course, they will certainly know the themes from session and be able to fill in the gaps quite well on what those themes mean for Iowa and what those themes mean for their district. And so I want you to be ready to hear these themes and be able to talk about them competently with your legislators in the interim to understand what they are talking about. So the first theme, of course, is taxes. And this is a theme that we care greatly about here at the League of Cities. This year was another year that was headlined with, quote, historic tax bills. Now, the last few years, this has been income taxes, it has been corporate taxes, and this year, the topic was property taxes. We're going to go into a little bit more detail shortly about what the property tax bill entailed. But other subjects which were brought up in this taxes category, of course, is sales taxes, and our specific interest is local option sales taxes. But of course, that bill did not advance. And so we can discuss that bill another time. But again, taxes were a very big theme this year. And if I were to guess, taxes will likely continue to be a recurring theme for legislative sessions in the future. Other themes which had less impact on local government, but again, were still themes for the legislature, still themes that the legislators cared deeply about. Another big one was education reform. The legislature passed ESAs, education savings accounts. This project took up much of the attention. We oftentimes say this took up a bulk of the oxygen in the room for, I would say, the good first month or two of session. This was something that the legislature and the governor continue to talk about and continue to work on through press releases. It's something that they are deeply caring about and that they will certainly spend a lot of time talking about next campaign cycle as well. And so education, of course, is a big topic this year that most legislators are going to know something about when it comes time to talking to constituents. Another big theme that we saw consume a lot of oxygen in the room was tort reform. The legislature passed a cap on non-economic damages against healthcare providers and hospitals. They also attempted a similar cap on motor carrier liability claims, but this bill was unsuccessful in getting through the process. This theme, as I mentioned, similarly took up a lot of attention at the beginning to middle session and consumed most of the conversations and energy of the building while it was working its way through the process. And finally, the last theme that I want to mention is Executive Order number 10. This is different than a legislative theme, but it certainly is going to be something that's talked about through administrative rules and the legislature. And Executive Order 10 was a directive from the governor to every state agency to review every line of administrative rules and have the Administrative Rules and Review Committee either repeal those rules, which are believed to be burdensome to industry and economic growth, and keep only those rules which are necessary and concise. I would say that this is one of the largest undertakings that we have seen from state government in some time. And I don't believe I'm selling this short at all. There are tens of thousands of lines of rules that will be reviewed over the next 5 years. And this will be done in sections. And everyone who cares about laws in Iowa will be watching this process very closely and be getting involved in this. So the league will be providing more information and more updates on Executive Order 10 in the future as this process plays out. We are just at the beginning. But we know that it will likely be important to monitor and engage this throughout the interim, and certainly something that we are considering whether or not membership engagement is something that's adequate for this. So we will be hopefully reaching out to individual cities to contact their legislators about specific rules throughout the process if those rules start to be moving through that we want to keep, or even if we want to add new rules throughout this process. Executive Order 10's process will be a very large project, again, for the next 5 to 7 years, which I hope every city will be paying attention to. But before we talk about any specific bill, the last thing I want to do is to make sure that you understand how to read new laws of interest. When you actually look at the document, there are some important details that you should know about. The first is that each bill is housed under a specific header, such as taxes, fees, revenues, technology, administration. We do have one miscellaneous that's kind of a catch-all. But this is just to provide a bit of organization to what is an otherwise large, unruly document. Some bills could be under two headers. Say a bill such as our property tax bill could certainly be under administration when it comes time to actually certifying the budget and the timelines that go in that. But obviously that bill is under taxes, fees, and revenues. So don't read this as gospel, but rather as a shortcut. If you're skimming the bill, you can sort of jump to a section that you remember from the past. Next, each bill has 4 parts, as in the description. And the first, of course, is the bill number. As I discussed earlier, this is largely for organizational purposes within the legislature. And while we may use this bill number for shorthand, know that general assemblies start each bill number over. And so if you're looking at a bill from last year, from 3 years ago, from 5 years ago, that bill number is specific to the General Assembly. And so it's important to know that when you talk about a bill number without sort of additional information, that you'll need to be able to reference which General Assembly you're in order for someone to find the right bill and to make sure you're talking about the right thing. The next, of course, is the bill name. And this is the Iowa League of Cities name for the bill. We try to be honest and not provide a slant when it comes to naming these bills. But if there is a commonly accepted moniker, sometimes we will use that. For instance, when the Public Safety Change Omnibus Bill, which is what we continue to call it for a little while past, everyone else knew that as the Back the Blue Bill. And while that moniker has a connotation to it, and there are oftentimes emotions associated with that, it was the widely accepted name. And so that's what we used as well. Sometimes you can even tell how someone feels about the bill simply on how they title it. And oftentimes there's a little bit of a combativeness to how they're speaking about a bill based on the title. Of course, a bill wouldn't be effective without an effective date. If a piece of legislation is quiet about the effective date, that is, that there is no effective date specifically outlined in the bill, then that bill becomes effective of July 1st, this year that it passes. So July 1st, 2023, many bills will become effective. Occasionally, if a bill is very, very complex, it can take effect far into the future. Occasionally, it'll be January 1st of the following year, or even July 1st of the following year. And that's largely to allow affected parties to work out any possible kinks or make sure that the bill is going to go into law effectively once it does. A bill can be deemed of immediate importance and take effect upon enactment or signature of the governor. And these bills oftentimes carry a narrative of real world impact that needs to happen now. We oftentimes see those bills, and that's kind of the two common ones, is July 1st or an immediately effective. Now, rarely, but certainly not never, a bill will have a retroactive effective date. going into the past and changing the law as it applied to circumstances that have already taken place is fortunately rare, but these retroactive applications do happen, and we even had a bill that affected cities that had a retroactive applicability date that took place earlier this session. So we'll get into that bill a little bit later, but just know that the effective date is extremely as important because oftentimes the online editions of code and certainly editions of Iowa code and books are not up to date until you get the effective dates and all the laws written into that. So effective dates are very important to keep in mind. We also highlight the sections affected, which is oftentimes a lot of details that you might not need if you're not a city attorney or looking for something very, very specific. But if you wanted to see what specific chapter of code, what specific sections of that chapter were modified at a quick glance, the amends section is certainly there. Again, I wouldn't use this as gospel. Many large bills have dozens, if not hundreds, of sections affected. And so we only mention the ones that are deeply important to cities. But it is sort of a quick guidepost that if you're looking for chapters in confidential records, that number will be easily identifiable within the new laws of interest. Now, I imagine a lot of folks that are watching this video are in hopes to learn more about House File 718, the property tax omnibus bill, which passed in 2023. I do want to make sure that I mention that the League is hosting a webinar solely dedicated to House File 718 on June 28th. This will be recorded and distributed, so if you can't make it, please don't worry. We will get that in front of as many people as we possibly can. Registration is required for that, and you can go to the Iowa League of Cities website to register. Additionally, the League has a webpage dedicated to explaining the more than 14 divisions of this bill and its impacts. And this fall, in addition to all this, I would encourage each and every one of you listening to attend the budget workshops hosted by the League of Cities, which will help cover the administrative effects and potentially even the budget forecasting effects of House File 718. Budget workshops, again, are held later in the fall, and more information about the League of Cities will be from the League of Cities will be shared later. So this legislation was immensely complicated. To describe the mechanisms in just a few minutes is going to be challenging, but I'm going to try. And in 14 divisions, nine of which affected city governments directly, the legislature consolidated many city levies into the new consolidated general fund. Then, based on your city's assessments of non-TIF taxable value, there will be a downward pressure on this newly consolidated levy rate. In addition to this new consolidation and downward pressure, there will be new communications sent to every property owner before a budget can be certified. This will take some significant coordination with your county counterparts. And so please brush off your Rolodexes and be in touch with your county auditors and treasurers. There was a change made to credits and exemptions, such as the elderly and disabled credit, as well as the military property tax credit. Additionally, bond elections or any election approving the indebtedness of the city will be required to take place in November. So you will have one opportunity to take bonds to the election once per year. Now, I will mention that there is a silver lining, if you can call it that. The one benefit to local governments within this bill is that general corporate purpose bonding thresholds, which trigger an automatic referendum, were increased by 30%. So these are tied to your city population. Small cities have a dollar amount, larger cities have a different dollar amount. Those dollar amounts that trigger an automatic referendum for general corporate purpose bonds have been increased by 30% in this bill. I do want to back it up real quickly, though, to go into a little bit more detail on the consolidated levies. The consolidated levies were not on every city levy. Some were left outside the consolidation and ratcheting system, and widely used ones are the special revenue levies, such as trust and agency, debt service levies, the employee benefits levy. Other levies that are outside of this downward pressure are the medical districts levy, which are not widely used, and the regional transit levies, which are also not widely used. So not every levy was affected, but many, many were. I think it was something close to 10 or 15 levies were consolidated into the new combined general fund. Additionally, the ratchet mechanism, which is extremely convoluted on paper. If you can read it and understand it, God bless you. But the best way to describe it is as having a shaving effect on levies based on the assessment growth of non-TIF taxable value. So for instance, if your city experiences very high taxable value growth, let's just say 20% in a year, your city will only be able to capture 17% of that growth by shaving or downward pressuring your general fund levy. There are several groups or tiers of shaving, and so not everyone's going to be treated equally within this either. If your city experiences high growth, or as they call it, more than 6% valuation growth, there will be a 3% shaving. If your city experiences between a 3 and 6% growth, there will be a 2% shaving. And if less than 3%, there will be not a shaving pressure on your levies. Now, again, this pressure, the shaving, this ratchet, whatever you want to call it, will expire in 4 years. There is a sunset provision of this, in which at that time, the 810 will be the new cap for all of these consolidated levies. So as I mentioned, this is a very convoluted bill. The impacts of this division will be described in more, better, and be able to ask questions in detail on the House File 7118 webinar, which will be made available after June 28th if you are not able to make the live showing. So registration is required. Again, go to our website to find that registration link. And we have more than 400 attendees. And so there will be a lot of people on this call, and that is taking place on June 28th. There are some other bills that I want to make sure that everyone knows about after listening to this presentation. And the first is Senate File 181. Now, this bill also impacted property tax, and this altered the residential rollback. Now, this bill, if you remember, had a retroactive applicability date, and this is because it occurred in the middle of the 2023 budget session. Typically, cities received their taxable valuation growth from the counties in early January. This is after the Department of Revenue issues our residential rollback figures. And again, this is all built up on building our budget. Throughout the legislative session, the legislature decided that the residential rollback had been miscalculated and they needed a retroactive applicable bill. Again, the administrative burden of this bill has already taken place. City budgets have been certified and we are past sort of the Band-Aid poll. But I would mention that the rollback figures that are calculated will be used for future calculations. And so rather than using the previous calculation of 56% and change, we will be using the 54% and change in the future as the residential rollback continues to move around. So that was Senate File 181, and it was one of the first large pieces of legislation that the League of Cities worked on. And additionally, Senate File 399, the legislature provided a definition of and a regulation of spray pads. Now, most cities I interact with have always described spray pads as being one or the other, but typically speaking, we hear about cities who have spray pads in which the water that hits somebody then runs down the drain and is treated just like stormwater. It sort of goes back into the natural ecosystem, but is cleaned after it touches somebody. This bill defines a spray pad as one in which water is circulated onto people and then recirculated back onto people and reused within this spray pad. This regulation is entirely on spray pads, which is the latter, which reuse water, then requires treatment of this water, and then puts it back onto people. And this is going to be followed very similarly to swimming pools. And so if your spray pad you believe needs to be updated or needs to be regulated in a different way, it's important that you look at the details of Senate File 399 to know that that is coming. Of course, not every bill that was passed this year was negative to cities, and these are a couple that I want to make sure that we all know about. In the last few years, there has been a decline of volunteer public safety officers across the state, and the legislature largely recognized that and is making an effort to maintain those populations. And we've seen several bills this year, a couple that did not pass, but these two did. House File 603 allows a public safety volunteer, which is defined in the bill, the ability to purchase one set of vehicle tires for their personal vehicle once every 3 years at the city negotiated rate. There is a rate for tire purchases that is negotiated by the state of Iowa that cities have access to, but several of the cities that I talk to, even ones as small as a few thousand in population, will negotiate a rate locally independently of the state. And so this bill basically authorizes your public safety officers to purchase one set of tires for their personal vehicle every so often. Now, the city is required to put on letterhead that they are a volunteer, how long that they've volunteered, and the license plate. The volunteer is required to pay for the tires and the taxes associated with that. This is not a free set of tires to them at the expense of the city. So that is very important. But all of this can be made available to your public safety volunteers if your city so chooses. And again, House File 603, the volunteer tire purchase, is hopefully trying to address a volunteer shortage by providing a little bit of extra incentive to stay with the program. Now, Senate File 183 dealt with the maximum age of retirement for peace officers. Now, the language that people use is either paid or professional, and those typically mean the same thing. But the maximum age of retirement for paid peace officers, for paid volunteer, or for paid firefighters is 65 years old. A new law, now Senate File 183, was put in place that exempts volunteer public safety officers from this age. Again, this is a change that is permissive for cities. If you have a very in shape volunteer fire department who is starting to age out by requirement of the law, and they wish to stay as a volunteer, and the city wishes to keep them, this bill simply allows cities to exceed the paid public safety age of retirement for volunteers. Now, these two bills, of course, were largely to benefit smaller communities who utilize volunteers for public safety, but obviously some careful considerations will be required by you on behalf of the city in order to utilize these changes in code. Now, these are just a few of the many bills and new laws, and I do want to save some of the excitement for our readers who pore over new laws like it's their favorite periodical. So I will say that you can read new laws in paper copy in the Cityscape magazine in July, and we will be distributing a link PDF format on our webpage and in our legislative news link letter, and I'm sure we will put it in League Weekly as well. So if you are not signed up for League Weekly for Legislative Link, or if you do not read our Cityscape magazine, please find our website and we'll make sure that we get you a copy of that. Now, despite what some believe, not every bill that we worked on passed into law. And while we are many, many grateful months away from the next legislative session, I do want to make sure to mention that it's important that you get the time to talk to your legislators, that you discuss the bills that have energy for next session. The bills up on the screen are just a few of the topics that we saw introduced during session that worked their way up until the process in 2023, but we will have to wait until 2024 for further consideration. If you have questions about what can be done today, I encourage you to contact me via email or by phone. My contact information, again, is available on our website. And I can go into more detail of these on sort of a case-by-case basis, but I do have reason to believe that there's a decent chance in 2024 that the issues you see on the screen in front of you will have a dialogue in the Capitol. So please contact your legislatures to talk about any and all of these if you get the time to do so. Now, a few reminders before we close out our presentation, and that is to check your inbox in the interim for Legislative Link and for League Weekly. Just because the Capitol is not happening on a daily basis and not all 150 legislators are here in the building does not mean that there is not important and impactful work being done on a regular basis. So please check your inbox for Legislative Link, for League Weekly. Legislative Link in particular will be sent out less frequently outside of session, but League Weekly is a 52 issue a year newsletter that you should be getting on a regular basis. Additionally, we have a webinar on House File 718 that will be ready to be viewed after it's recorded July 28th. If you are unable to make that live, June 28th, if you are unable to make that live recording, this will be the first of many communications on House File 718. We will continue these conversations in our budget workshops this fall. I expect that we will have large attendance, and so please get signed up for those as early as you see them posted. I hope you have the chance to attend these, as these will be content that people have never seen before. It will not be sort of the routine stuff that we see year in and year out. And of course, I'd be remiss to mention, if we didn't, that September we are going to be in Cedar Rapids this year for our annual conference. That is September 22nd through 24th. It will be a wonderful opportunity for everyone to learn, to network, and to get up to speed on the latest and greatest municipal government issues. So thank you again for joining me today to discuss the new laws of 2023. I thank you for your time. And as a reminder, please do contact me with any questions you have, but most importantly, be in contact with your legislators. They are in your district, they are tending fields, they are out in businesses, and legislative session for 2024 is right around the corner. So thank you very much for joining us.